Hi, Dr. Starsky. I hope everything's going well. This is the first part of the assignment. I have the pink as the normal gait pattern ankle movement, and then the purple line is what I drew from the video that you showed us. So starting at 0, so or heel contact, I had her in generally the same position, maybe a little bit more plantar flexed. And then she dips down into that peak of plantar flexion, which is the first rocker. And she did lack that controlled movement, so it was more of the forefoot hitting the ground, or not quite a slap, but I thought it was faster than what a controlled movement would look like. And then she returns to neutral, slower than the typical pattern would, because instead of using that controlled eccentric plantar flexor activation, the tibia was more carried over as the body was just translating forward. So it was more of a passive movement of the lower limb, which is why I have it slower. And then she hangs out in neutral for a while. I thought even slightly plantar flexed for some of this, but a very small amount due to her knee being extended, or what I thought was even hyperextended at times through this part. So that's why this is a little bit more plantar flexed than just at neutral. And that's also a notable thing about her gait, is that her knee is extended here versus as it normally would be flexed during this part, which is what also contributes to her staying right here versus the typical movement. And then at 45%, I had that as where her heel starts coming off the ground, but then the most heel rise is kind of the 50 to 60%, which is notable because typically that happens earlier in the gait pattern, around like 30-35%. And again, that's less from muscle activation, more just the tibia being passively brought forward as the body continues to translate forward. So then I have the peak in plantar flexion here, which is less than typical because she is lacking that propulsion and muscle activation, as everything is just kind of passive. And then she hangs out here for a little bit. I have at about 70-80% is where her toe off occurs, which typically would happen sooner. And then she returns back to neutral around 90%. So she has toe drag around this portion of her gait. And as you can see, her plantar flexion is about half of what it would normally be for typical gait. But that toe drag is also caused because the knee is staying more extended for a longer period of time than it would in typical gait, which then makes the limb longer and creates that toe drag, or almost toe drag for some parts. So typically, at toe off at 60%, the knee will start flexing for the first half of gait, and then the second half of gait will slowly return to that extended position, being ready for heel contact. But for her toe off isn't until later, so that knee is staying straight this whole time through her gait pattern. And then at toe off, which I had at like 75%, that's when her knee starts to flex, but still isn't at enough flexion to prevent the toe from dragging on the ground. And then that knee continues that flexed position up until almost 95%, and then starts to extend, preparing for heel contact. So that whole portion of knee flexion occurs later and is drawn out later because of that late toe off and longer time on double limb support and all of that together. And for treatment options, the first I have is dorsiflexor strengthening exercises. So the purple is the band pulling down, and then she would be lying supine, bringing her toes up to work on strengthening those muscles so she can clear her toes during swing, and then also for the other parts of gait that I described before. Another option is AFOs, but then that would limit her ability to plantar flex, which would just hurt the part of propulsion for the gait cycle mainly. But I would argue that dorsiflexion is a bigger concern right now, since that's what's leading her to have the toe drag, and that's the biggest risk for falling and preventing injury in the future. And then the third treatment option could be E-stem on tibialis anterior to work on or to have that dorsiflexion movement. And then also you can incorporate gastroc, soleus, posterior tib to do the plantar flexion movement if we also want to incorporate those movements too, and then work your way up the leg based on knee flexion, extension, and all of that at the same time. So for my first gait deviation, I chose right low extremity vaulting at the ankle due to left low extremity lack of knee flexion, which I'll show here. Okay, so for right low extremity vaulting due to left lack of knee flexion, this is what I drew for the ankle movement. So dorsiflexion on the top, plantar flexion on the bottom. The pink, once again, would be normal ankle movement for a typical gait pattern, and then purple is what I drew for vaulting. So as you can see, it's the same for all the outside movements, but in mid-stance, that's where it becomes different. So the left lower extremity goes through the swing phase about 10 to 15% of the gait cycle, which is what causes the vaulting, because the lack of knee flexion makes the lower or the left limb longer. So during the swing phase, the right extremity vaults up to elevate the body and help clear the toes for the left extremity to prevent tripping or toe drag and such. So where the right ankle would normally start dorsiflexing, instead at about 15 degrees, it starts doing a sharp excessive plantar flexion with a peak at 30% of the gait cycle, because that's when the left lower extremity will be the longest during its swing phase, and then a sharp return back to neutral around 50-55% as it carries out the rest of the gait cycle typically. So like I said before, the first half of the stance phase, it is going into sharp plantar flexion. In the second half, it's returning back to neutral to help clear that lengthened limb on the left side to prevent tripping and other injuries. So treatment for right limb vaulting. So first it would be determining what's causing the vaulting, whether it's left limb, lack of hip, knee flexion, or right-sided lack of dorsiflexion. So in our case, I narrowed it down to, we found out it's left limb lack of knee flexion. So I'll demonstrate these later too, but here's a drawing of strengthening the hamstrings to work on left limb knee flexion, assuming it's due to weakness. So first, I would say a good starting point would be having the patient prone, using a band pulling down, so they're focusing on just the hamstrings and strengthening by pulling up. And then I'm thinking it can also be progressed to having the patient standing using ankle weights, and then this will be more focusing on the functional movement of gait, so having hip at neutral and then hip maybe 10-15 degrees to flex, so it would be like what the hip would be in gait pattern while it needs this knee flexion. And then so keeping this, focusing on core, hip, all the other lower extremity and then trunk movements while strengthening the hamstrings.